charge distribution, and where you also can see the local electrical field, magnitude and vector field. This can be a great asset to normal STEM images, which is very popular in material science, but then most of the people use only annular dark field. And this is really possibility to learn much more about your sample. So this is the outline of my presentation, and directly I give the acknowledgement today. So I start with the short introduction where we have been using these techniques to image directly hydrogen atomic columns in materials. And this is already presented last year by my PhD student, Sietse de Graaf, who presented this in January last year, also in this NAMI-related workshop of the Material Science Working Group. And so I will be a little bit brief, but still I think it's a very good introduction to the next topic. So therefore I still again explain this a bit how this is worked. And it was particularly in collaboration between our group in Groningen and between Thermo Fisher Scientific, where also Sorin Lazar did some, also some imaging, and Christoph Mitterbauer did also some local EELS measurements in our materials. And then the second topic I will discuss is recent work. This is a collaboration with the group of Professor Beatrice Noheda from the University of Groningen, where we collaborated particularly with a postdoc of her group. We have epitaxial Hafnia devices, and then inside the TM, we apply in situ electrical biasing. And really what is, I think, very nice is that we can see atomic resolution oxygen migration, so light element migration, which is crucial for the performance of the Hafnia, which is a ferroelectric. But in this case, the ferroelectricity is crucially linked also to the oxygen sublattice, so you have to image it. And this was particularly the most of the TM work was done with a collaborator in my group, Majid Ahmadi, who did the work. And we are also very helped by the holder from hennyz.com. So that is Henny Zandbergen, where we could use this to do electrical biasing in our system. And finally, the topic is where we do atomic resolution really at 30 kV. And this is a topic tungsten disulfide has been discussed before in the earlier presentation. And we can see atomic resolution, not only looking at the tungsten atoms, but particularly also looking at the sulfur sublattice, and also see all kinds of the defects, how they appear over time. And we can even record movies at like 30 kV, 60 kV, with a lot of details inside this type of, say, thin films. And I focus only on the monolayer. And this is again work done in my group by my PhD student, Sietse de Graaf. And then I end up with some conclusions. Okay, so also introduced by Albert Polman, it's not only always about TM. Sometimes you need to do work which can be very well done in an SEM. I will show it. And that's also a microscope which was installed in our lab in the spring 2017. Then we have, of course, need of a very good focused ion beam system which can cut out thin lamella for our TM. And this is with our Helios FIB SEM dual beam system, which was operational in the spring of 2018. And then finally, we have the TMZ, which can operate from 30 kV up to 300 kV. And it's double aberration corrected and monochromated. And we do most of the imaging finally in this machine. Today, I will show results obtained with this TMZ. But why we need all the instruments? For instance, sometimes we have crystals and we have to cut crystals really in a specific direction, and we have finally to image it in the TM in a specific zone direction. And this is, for instance, a hexagonal material, and for hexagonal we had to image it really, it was crucial to image it along the z-axis, and there is only one specific z-axis direction in space, so we really were important that we found in this case a lamella, which where the z-axis were almost perfectly in plane, such that we could cut it with taking out the lamella, that it's correctly oriented, and we could put it in the zone axis that we look along the hexagonal z-axis. And then we put it after this first analysis, we put it in the, say, dual beam system where we cut out the thin lamella. And this is a special material because this is titanium and titanium hydride plates are forming. So these are very thin plates. In the end, they can cause embrittlement. They can really fracture the material. But these are very straight planes with very sharp edge-on interface. And this is crucial when we do the TM imaging. So we have this lamella, which is in a specific orientation where we have planar interfaces we can image, and then we can image these in a thin area, of course, at the edge. We can image them in the TM. And this is then the imaging we do in the TM. This is more familiar to you. This is typically high-angle annular dark field imaging, where we in this case only see titanium atoms, but this is a special type of imaging. And I want to convince you that we see here beautifully, we can see both the titanium but also the hydrogen atoms in between. Yeah? So here you can see alternating dark and brighter spots, which indicate that in between here we have a sublattice of hydrogen. So why is this interesting? Because currently one of the big challenges in scanning transmission electron microscopy is really to image light atoms next to heavy ones. Just with angular dark field, you can beautifully image the carbon atoms in graphene and monolayer, no problem at all. But the problem arises when you have both light atoms and heavy atoms at the same time, because then the signal of the light atoms is completely washed out and you cannot see it in normal angular dark field imaging. So what you do, you have to image, say, in another method, and I will explain how we do it. And then to really tackle this problem, we took the most challenging type of element. This is hydrogen. Actually, we can do proton imaging. Yeah, single proton. We can, in the end, it's not a single proton, but a column of protons. And we can image them at the same time next to, in this case, titanium atoms. That's what we do. And why is this also relevant from a material science perspective? Because hydrogen can be important for our society as an energy carrier. And then, of course, we have to store the hydrogen, and then hydrogen storage is an important issue. But also, hydrogen can embrittle, particularly metals, and this is a really serious problem, also for nuclear power plants, where they can be produced hydrogen in the walls, and they can, in the end, create hydrogen embrittlement. And this is really crucial, yeah, that we can learn more about hydrogen. So how could we measure the hydrogen? And that's, of course, if you do annular dark field, and then particularly at high angle, then, of course, heavy atoms have sufficient scattering in a scanning transmission electron microscope to have sufficient signal on the high angle annular detector. And then, of course, if you want to image the light atoms, in this case, the hydrogen atoms depicted here as the red dots, then, of course, you have to make only imaging at the small angles. For instance, this is the bright field disk. You have to capture the bright field disk on a detector. However, if you do that, you come back to a kind of normal TM imaging where you have all kind of wave interferences, and then it becomes very hard to be sure with wave interference if you really image really atoms, or that it's just a subsidiary maximum of a wave. And this is very crucial to be sure that you see really atoms and not kind of wave effects. So we want to get rid of a kind of wave effect and to see again really the phase of the sample, for instance, and not all kind of phase, say, reversals which can happen in normal TM image. And the way we do that is using 4 segmented detectors. And in a smart way, we combine the signal from, for instance, opposite detectors, and then use at a different signal to really come up with a proper signal which we can interpret. So only the measurement technique alone is not sufficient. You also need a very good sample. And I think we found a very interesting case where we have an interface between hexagonal titanium, and this is phase-centered tetragonal titanium hydride, but such that the hydrogen sublattice cannot just be similar symmetry as the underlying lattice of the titanium, because we have only a half-filled sublattice, such that we have here only hydrogen atoms in one, for instance, say, row and one column, but the column in between is empty and the row in between is empty. And this is important because it means if you have wave interference effects, that it cannot give here a peak, because then everywhere in the middle a peak should be present and not only at half of the empty side. So we have both the technique and the sample to really properly now measure light elements. And this is what we did. We analyze this, and then we can analyze the interface at local scale in, for instance, the normal annular dark field mode. It's incoherent imaging. We only see the titanium atoms because the hydrogen atoms are too light to cause scattering up to this large angles. And you can, of course, do annular bright field imaging. That is just before, like I showed, you just use the total signal from the detector. Yeah, but you don't use any smart trick. And it turns out this is very sensitive. This is relative thick specimen. There is a huge stress of the hydride, which is formed the plate inside this metal, which creates bending and all kinds of problems. And in annular bright field, you cannot properly see, the hydrogen atoms in a robust way. Yeah. And then you can say, okay, maybe there is filtering here. No, the signal in the end is identical, and all the images have been filtered at best what is possible in identical ways. And then here we have this special way, this is called integrated differential phase contrast. And actually it's most close, that is the phase shift caused by the specimen, that is what we image. And then we also, in this case, have atoms are most of the time always bright in a black surrounding. And this is very similar to what we have in annular dark field imaging. So the interpretation is more straightforward, because in annular bright field, it's also possible that atoms can be both bright, black, and you don't know exactly what the wave interference effects, what they produce. Yeah? So this is important. So for the hydrogen image, particularly, it turns out this IDPC is very powerful. However, simultaneously, we measure also DDPC, it's called differential phase contrast. And this is particularly connected to how charges are distributed in the specimen. And we can also locally image the electrical field, that's called just DPC, differential phase contrast imaging. And this is at atomic resolution, we can image then the electrical field in the sample. Since electrical field is of course a vector field, you both have here the magnitude of the vector field and here the direction of the vector field. And we can really, with this DPC technique, we can measure local electrical fields in samples. And this is a non-magnetic sample, but you can imagine if this would be magnetic, for instance, then this could be connected also, for instance, to skyrmions on a much larger scale, of course, then you can image local magnetic textures in the sample. So this is the power of this technique. But here we really do it at the atomic resolution scale. And also you can see, you can very well simulate this, and there is really a very good resemblance between what we simulate and between the experimental image. So this all gives you a very good match that what we see. And now the point is here, indeed, I hope you can see it. We see here the bright spots in this titanium hydride. These are the titanium atoms, but here we have some brightness which come from hydrogen. This is filled, and here we have the empty side. So we really have this checkerboard pattern that half of the sides in between the titanium are either empty or they are filled, and we can really image the hydrogen. Close to the interface, this is very hard to measure, yeah, because of all kinds of strain effects. But if we go more further away from the interface, we have more high quality regions in the specimen, and then you really can see beautifully the difference between angular dark field, where we only see the heavy atoms, annular bright field, where we do not use in a smart way the low angle scattering, and we have quite some noise. But if we use exactly the same signal and we try to optimize both signals, we use the same electrons, but here we use in a smart way, we use the 4 segments of the detector. Then you can see nicely that we see here the hydrogen atoms in between the titanium. And indeed, you see half of the sides tends to be empty, and the other half of the sides of the columns tend to be filled. So this is really showing the power of this integrated differential phase contrast that you can image this. And this we published, say, 1 year ago, January 2020, it was published in Science Advances. So this is a nice introduction, because for the next 2 topics, I also will use particularly IDPC, but also, for instance, the electrical field we can measure on the atomic scale, both the magnitude and the vector field. So the second talk is connected to epitextual Hafnia devices, and what we really do in the TM here, we use in situ electrical biopsy. So we have a special holder made available by Henny Zandberg, which we can use in the microscope, and we can then produce with the focused ion beam, we can produce a very thin lamella. Yeah, and the lamella is really a complex device, as I will show, of different epitextually grown oxides, and we can apply an electrical bias. And this preparation is really, really very tricky, because in the end you apply a few volts, and then you must be sure there is no any leakage around the sample, that all the voltage goes through the sample, is across the sample, and there is not any leakage path, and you have a very clean, say, insulating substrate where you can put it over a hole where it's transparent. So this we applied for in situ electrical biasing. And this is connected with Hafnia. And this is a hot topic this moment in the material science, because Hafnia is a very unique new ferroelectricity, which is now known for about 11 years, that when you scale it down to a thickness of only 1 nanometer, yeah, then it's still ferroelectric, and even it's better ferroelectric than in a bulk material. So this scaling down is important, because ferroelectricity has been used in all kinds of electrical devices. But for a standard ferroelectric materials, there was always a problem if you scaled it down to a thickness of only, say, 10 nanometer or less, your ferroelectricity is gone in the end, and it's not properly working anymore. But now this is really a breakthrough new ferroelectric, which can work really at a thickness of 1 nanometer thickness. And moreover, it's fully compatible with the normal CMOS processing, because hafnium oxide is really also used as the high K dielectric gate oxide in modern field effect transistors. So it's already in all computers or chips, it's now available and really compatible. And in the end, oxides are in the end, say, relative high resistance materials, and this can also connect to very low power electronics. And so you can use it for memory application, for field effective translations applications, or for so ferroelectric tunnel junctions. So they're all kind of electronic, say, nano electronics devices where it can be used for. And for instance, now also big investment in startup, and also the bigger foundries started a lot of investments in, say, new type of maybe memories based on ferroelectricity. For instance, in Germany, there is a big investment or a new company which is called Ferroelectric Memory Company. So in the end, of course, there is a lot of interesting results which spark this a lot of, say, new results and also investment, but still a complete understanding what is happening in these ferroelectric oxide is still, say, missing. And particularly also the mechanism which gives rise to the ferroelectricity is still a debate. Yeah, so we also want to contribute with our work to this topic. So now what we do, we have these, say, devices, and then the thing I want to show, we have this bottom electrode grown epistexual on strontium titanate, and this bottom electrode is made on what we call, for simplicity, LSMO. Yeah, it's actually a little bit complicated structure based on lanthanum, strontium, manganese, and oxide. Yeah, these are the heavy elements. This is a lighter metal element, and then we have the oxygen. But can remember that this is a kind of ABO3 structure, which we normally can see that it's a perovskite structure. And then we have this sandwich of this both, say, oxide electrodes, and in between we have this special material which is based on hafnium, zirconia, oxygen. Normally there is one, say, cation with respect to 2 anions, and this is the ratio of 1 to 2. But this is actually an alloy containing both hafnium and zirconia, and it is abbreviated to HCO. So now we'll focus in, and of course these are relatively large structures. If you give overview pictures, you don't see any atomic resolution, but I start showing results from this, say, bottom electrode, say, in the order of about 5 to 10 nanometer away from this interface to the, say, hafnium oxide. Okay, so what do we see? We start with the initial structure, and then we have the perovskite structure, like I said, for this bottom electrode LSMO. And then if we apply in situ in the electron microscope, we start to apply voltage, we see that there is some structure changing. The manganese atoms, each time here in the middle between the more heavy atoms, these are here coupled to a strange buckling of the for the octahedrons. And this is logical. This is the standard structure of perovskite. But if you apply a positive bias, you see that there is a kind of straightening. Still, it's not clear what happens, and therefore it's important we go to larger bias. And then we see at 4-fold what happens. We have a transition to another type of oxide. There is a phase transition where actually we lose quite some of these brown colored oxygen atoms in between here, the manganese atoms, and that gives rise to this kind of holes at atomic resolution. And it's crucial, this cannot be done at high angle and the dark field. You really need to have IDPC to image both the manganese and the oxygen atom to have the good, say, resolution, the good contrast for both the light and the heavy elements in the structure. So what actually happens, you go from a material which is kind of higher concentration of oxygen to a material where you lose quite some oxygen and it becomes oxygen deficient. So what we actually do, the bottom electrode with positive bias is getting rid of oxygen. It's getting oxygen deficient. And then you can say, okay, it can go out. It's a thin sample. It can go out to the vacuum. And indeed, this happened. We also did in situ heating. So with heating, indeed, you can heat these structures and you lose in the first time, you lose oxygen and then it gets oxygen deficient. Here, there is something very interesting. If we go now to 0-fold, this is kind of non-volatile. The structure remains. But now if we start to apply negative bias, actually in negative bias, you see that oxygen comes back. So we really push in with negative voltage, we go back in the end to the, say, perovskite structure back in this case. So we can really reversible, and this is the crucial point, with using this biasing in the microscope, we can see the oxygen sublattice and we can pump in and pump out the oxygen atoms. So what actually happens, we look here at the bottom electrode. In this case, with positive bias, we bring in oxygen vacancies and such that we get an oxygen deficient material in the bottom electrode. But if we use this is positive bias, if we use negative bias, the other way around, the vacancies move to the top electrode and we again reoxygenate this bottom electrode. So we can see that at atomic resolution, this type of process is going on, and not just in annular dark field, but really crucial that we also see both the heavy and the light atoms in say, IDPC imaging. So this is all IDPC based imaging. Then you can question how fast are these processes going. And at 3-fold, we did time dependence, and this is now not IDPC, but this is based on annular dark field, where we not see the oxygen atoms properly, but still we can have, say, with all the previous knowledge, enough idea how the structure changes, and you get a kind of doubling of periodicity. You can see some effects, what is happening, and we can see how fast the process goes. And in, say, 3-fold, it's the order of 1 minute. So both getting out the oxygen with positive bias voltage or getting back in the oxygen at a negative voltage. So it's the order of 1 minute. And then you say, okay, this is pretty slow. This is true. Still, it's relatively fast that we can measure this. The point is, this is really very nonlinear, and this is known for all this type of devices. Sometimes it's called the voltage time dilemma. If you do it at 1 volt, then the whole process also in the TM, it's the order of hours that the transformation takes place. Now at 3 volts, it goes to the order of 1 minute. Yeah? And the point is this, we can, of course, we didn't measure in the TM, but if we know that in devices, if we go to 6 volt, it goes to switching in sub-milliseconds. So the point is, in the end, the slow in situ TM process PC are still very relevant for much faster switching devices, yeah, in the actual devices. And this was only the bottom electrode. So what is now actually happening in this crucial layer in between, which is called this hafnia zirconia oxide. And this epitaxial grow, and if we grow it, we start with strontium titanate as the substrate, then we grow a first layer of LSMO, then we grow this HZO, and then we grow the top layer of LSMO. Then this hafnia oxide, here it's a very thin layer, order of, let's say, 6 nanometers in this case. Then we can apply the voltage, and we see not much structural changes. We still can see, I hope you can see it in the inset, the bright atoms here that are the, say, hafnia and zirconium ions, but next to it there's 2 kind of weaker peaks, and these are the oxygen ions, and this is also connected to the structure. So we can see the polarization, how the structure couples to the, say, experimental image, and this is the simulation. And then in this case, it's crucial that oxygen sublattice imaging is essential to measure the ferroelectric polarization. Because in most, say, perovskite structure, it's a difference between the 2 types of cations. For instance, in lead titanate, it's a difference in shifting between the lead and titanium atoms. And this people did already using all the techniques like annular dark field, where you're only sensitive for the more heavy atoms, and then it's sufficient to see the displacement of the 2 heavy atom sublattices. But in this case, you really have to have the displacement of the oxygen atoms compared to the heavy metal atoms, because the one is the positive and the other is the negative. And in this way, you can measure the polarization. And then what happens, we apply the voltage. We have really little, say, polarization by the electrical voltage. But we also know we push oxygen atoms out of the bottom with positive voltage, bottom electrode, into this layer towards the top electrode. So now it's really a question, is this, say, displacement, this is ferroelectric displacement, is it connected to really ferroelectricity, or is it connected to also the oxygen vacancies which are pushing here in, that we get from more oxygen deficient structure to a more oxygen richer structure? And actually there is also clear evidence that we go to an oxygen richer structure, because this is then again annular dark field imaging, where we can see that we can switch at 4 volt, and if we go back to 0 volt is retained, that we see that we have not the R structure, the rhombohedral structure, but we have the orthorhombic and the monoclinic crystals present. And these are really a signature, important signature, that we make a more stoichiometric, say, ratio of the hafnia and zirconia with respect to the oxygen. And this is a clear sign that if we go to 4-fold, that we push oxygen from the bottom electrode into this layer, and that we can do it. And we can push them back out again, that we pull back to -3 and we push the oxygen atoms back into the bottom electrode. So that is what happened. So now, is this only question for this type of capacitor structure? We also check this, and this is not in situ work, but we have also, in this case, tunnel junction, where the top electrode is, we start with a ferroelectric. This is very interesting also for memory devices, a ferroelectric coupled to a ferromagnet in this case, and we can switch it with different resistance states. But also here we can show that if we go to positive bias, then we have, in this case, we get oxygen out of the bottom electrode and we move it into this cobalt, and actually the cobalt is oxidized. We get an oxygen deficient structure, and we move it, say, back by going to negative bias, then we get a more perovskite-based structure, which is again less oxygen deficient. And here the nice point is we can do this switching in the devices at half a millisecond, so 500 microseconds at 6-volt, showing indeed that these switches can be done at much faster scale if we do it in a linear device. So one of the bottom lines is now that the ferroelectric polarization in this special material based on hafnium zirconium oxide, that it's not only just simple ferroelectric polarization, but it's of course closely related also to the oxygen vacancies in the material, and then it's closely sensitive to how you push oxygen out of the bottom electrode to the top electrode and back, and how you populate the vacancies in this layer. So this is now published on arXiv, and we have quite good, reasonable comments from the reviewers from Science. And then we are very positive that maybe this can be published in Science within, say, the next couple of months. Okay, now my last topic. So my last topic is about tungsten disulfide monolayers. In this case, it's a transition metal dichalcogenide. But now the very special point is that we image it at 30 kV. So traditional people image it at good resolution, was possible for many years at 200 and 300 kV. But these materials, of course, you can easily damage by the electron beam, and then the knock-on damage is really very dramatic at 200 and 300 kV. And so you have to lower the accelerating voltage. There are quite some results shown at 60 kV, but 30 kV is still quite special. And particularly up to now, no one has shown transition metal dichalcogenide at, say, 30 kV, in combination also with the other techniques connected to, like, integrated differential phase contrast, phase contrast based on DDPC, and the electrical field, the magnitude, and the vector field of the electrical field. And that is nice because you can see, and this is important, here is, for instance, a sulfur vacancy. And if you look in the high angular dark field, you can see some effect that probably here the shoulder is a little bit lower, but your sensitivity towards the light element, silver, is really not good in angular dark field. Again, you need a technique which is more sensitive to the light elements, and that integrated differential phase contrast is very sensitive. And you see a very good difference between two silver atoms in the monolayer of tungsten disulfide, single monolayer, or even no monolayer, as I was, or no silver, double silver vacancy in the monolayer. Still, it's now very good to have both techniques simultaneously, and this is possible. You can measure at the low scattering angle on this, say, detector, at typically like annular bright field detector, but then segmented, and you can simultaneously measure this electron scatter to high angle. Because here, the two silvers have almost similar intensity as the tungsten. So sometimes it can be confusing if you only measure only IDPC, that you're not 100% sure where are the silver atoms paired and where is the single tungsten atom in the monolayer. And also you can see defects in this case are very beautifully can be seen in this material in differential phase contrast, where you see the electrical field, the magnitude of the electrical field at atomic resolution. And so in the next slide, we see that this affects, we see it both for a single and a double vacancy. So here is a single vacancy, that is in this one, but here is actually a double sulfur vacancy in this, say, IDPC image. And you see you have a very good contrast going from 2 sulfur atoms to a single sulfur atom to 0 sulfur atom, so a double sulfur vacancy. However, if you do the same in high angle and angular dark field, the contrast is already very weak for the sulfur, and it's very, say, difficult to image this in a really robust manner. And also there can be a problem that if your monolayer in this case is not perfectly perpendicular to the electron beam, but very slightly tilted, that this already can give artifacts, particularly in this way if you can image both the sulfur and the tungsten atoms at the same time. And this gives some problem, which we don't have so much this problem in IDPC. Okay, what we can do with that now, we can really record movies. We can do this at 30 kV, 60 kV, we did this. And we have now sensitivity not only to the heavy element, this is tungsten, but particularly also to the light elements, that is sulfur. So from particularly here, the electrical field, local magnitude, we can see different frames, and actually frames have been taken with an interval time of only 5 seconds. Yeah, and then of course the real frame was bigger. We took only small portions of the total image. Yeah, and then what is nice, so we have a kind of movie capacity which is not possible, for instance, in today's pixelated detectors with 4D tychography. So this is really a focus of many research around the world to get the best imaging out of scanning transmission electron microscopy, to use pixelated detectors. But they are intrinsically, say, currently way too slow to have this fast capturing capability that you can do of in scanning transmission electron microscopy, because it's still sequential and you really have to capture frames relatively quickly. So we can follow all these kind of defects in the material. And then we can see, for instance, in this case, locally, the tungsten vacancy appears, and you see, but it can also be annealed back. It can disappear again. These are really 5 seconds interval images taken from a movie, and you can follow in details what happens to single sulfur vacancies, double sulfur vacancies, the tungsten vacancy, and how it evolves over time in these type of materials. You see also sometimes special things happen here. You can see that is kind of line effects. That's known that sometimes the sulfur vacancies tend to cluster, start to cluster in lines, and you can very nicely in IDPC and in this magnitude of the electrical field, you can follow at atomic resolution how these sulfur atoms, how they cluster. This was already known from, for instance, the high angular in the dark field, but then it's a very subtle effect that only the distance between the planes of the, in this case, the heavy tungsten atoms are slightly, say, getting shorter, and then you know there must be sulfur vacancy in between. But really robust imaging at a fast rate, then you cannot see the sulfur atoms anymore in this type of technique, and you have to use it in combination with these, say, correlated directly combined imaging with based on differential phase contrast. So finally, we can also follow if holes are formed, and even at 30 kV, we had, say, quickly, particularly in chemical vapor deposited tungsten disulfide, even at 30 kV, we produce holes. Yeah, so, and then in the holes, we can still follow what is on the end for general interest, also for graphene ribbons or for all kind of ribbons of this type of 2D materials. We can see what happens at the edges of the interface, very detailed with, in this case, integrated differential phase contrast, but you can hardly see the details if you only have angular dark field, where you can only see contrast strongly of the heavy atoms. So we have now results, what I showed today, for 30 kV. We have also movies recorded at 60 kV. We have results for chemical vapor deposited monolayers of tungsten disulfide, and we have it also for exfoliated. So we can compare all the dynamics in these materials based on the methodology I explained today in this presentation. With that, I come to my conclusion, and then I hope that today I could convince you that particularly for material science, scanning transmission electron microscopy is in the end more powerful than TEM, because TEM is particularly based on wave characteristics, which are often difficult for interpretation, particularly for non-periodic specimens. So if you really want to know very well what happens in your material, if it's possible, you can apply scanning transmission electron microscopy at atomic resolution. But this is popular already for many years because it's incoherent imaging, yeah, but it's only sensitive to the heavy atoms, or at least not simultaneously for heavy and light elements. And I hope that I showed you today that all this different imaging based on differential phase contrast, this can really help to get a much more in-depth understanding what is your atomic scale structure of the material. Also, strong developments are there that if you can go to lower accelerating voltage, you still can image materials which otherwise at 200 and 300 kV would not survive because of the very heavy knock-on damage in the material. And then it's really very nice that with modern instruments, we have atomic resolution even down to 30 kV. And this gives also options maybe for biosamples. However, I have also to say a downside. The knock-on damage is of course strongly reduced, that single electrons cannot kick out atoms from a structure, but still what can happen is radiolysis, the bond breaking, chemical bond breaking can be much more severe. And actually we see also at 30 kV of the tungsten disulfide that we have easy damage formation and we have easy hole formation in monolayers of this material, even at 30 kV. So you have to be careful that not always it's better at lower accelerating voltage, and that some things even can get worse, and then it's maybe better to work at higher accelerating voltage to have better transmission. In the end, for in situ measurements, it's very nice that we have these aberration correctors because we still have atomic resolution with large pole-piece gaps, which allow, of course, more space for future also for all kinds of in situ experiments. And I also showed today that we can use very nice electrical biasing in the microscope to have reversible, say, switching possible. In situ heating is nice, but this is often sometimes only irreversible. But now with electrical biasing, we can do, for instance, reversible processes in material and to image it. Okay, I thank you for your attention, and I hope you have some questions for me.